The grand marble sanctuary smelled of heavy incense and bitter betrayal as the white silk veil was violently ripped from my trembling hands. King Garrick stared down from the golden dais, his icy gray eyes narrowing with absolute disgust as he grabbed my wrists and forced my scarred palms into the blinding light of the ceremonial torches for the entire court to see. "Look at this broken creature," he bellowed, his alpha roar, shaking the stained glass windows as he threw me brutally to the polished stone floor, declaring that an Omega with such ruined hands would never be a fit mate to carry the royal lineage of the Northern Pack. The cruel laughter of the noble court echoed through the high arches, cutting deeper than any blade as tears of raw humiliation burned my cheeks, and I gathered my torn skirts to flee, running blindly into the freezing dark of the volcanic peaks where the shadows could hide my shame. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. My breath hitched as the wind tore at my skin, but a new defiance sparked deep within my broken soul. The passage of time in the black crags of the volcanic peaks did not measure itself by the ticking of delicate courtly clocks or the changing of silk gowns, but by the slow cooling of molten stone and the relentless piling of winter snow against the mouth of the cavern. 3 long years had dissolved into the mist since the night Rhea had fled the Golden Palace, her lungs burning with the frost of the high altitude and her heart shattered by the cruel echoing laughter of the alpha nobility. She had found refuge in a forgotten, desolate place where the earth itself bled liquid sulfurous fissures, creating a strange, isolated sanctuary of suffocating heat and biting mountain air. Her daily existence became a solitary rhythm of physical labor, a deliberate choice to bury her grief beneath the crushing weight of ironstone and volcanic slate. Every morning before the sun could even breach the jagged horizons, she wrapped her forearms in thick, cured leather, hiding the severe web of old burn scars that had once defined her failure in the eyes of a superficial king. She carried a heavy canvas sack down into the jagged ravines where the black sand was rich with raw hematite and natural iron deposits, pulling the heavy ores from the frozen crust with her bare fingers, despite the agonizing stiffness that always settled into her joints during the dawn hours. She was entirely invisible to the world she had left behind, a ghost living above the clouds whose name was only whispered as a cautionary tale of a broken Omega who could not survive the mating altar. Yet in this harsh, forgotten wilderness, Rhea found a strange, profound comfort in her absolute obscurity, because the stones did not mock her and the fire did not ask her to be beautiful or submissive. She constructed a crude stone forge deep within the belly of the cavern, using her precise understanding of natural ventilation to channel the hot thermal currents through a handmade chimney of packed clay and basalt. Her inner thoughts were no longer consumed by the suffocating memories of the royal rejection, but were instead occupied by the beautiful, complex calculations of heat distribution, mineral purity, and molecular strength. She learned to read the subtle changes in the mountain wind, using the air currents to regulate the temperature of her coals until the dark cavern glowed with a magnificent, blinding crimson light. The few low-ranking frontier sentries who occasionally patrolled the lower tree lines caught glimpses of the thick, dark smoke rising from the peak, but they dismissed it as mere volcanic activity, completely unaware that a discarded girl was seeking empire of heat and steel in the dark wilderness. Her hands, which King Garrick had declared completely useless, grew stronger and more callous with every passing season, the muscles in her shoulders hardening into dense knots of resilient power as she lifted the heavy iron mallets to strike the raw metal against the anvil face. She spent hours watching the glowing embers, thinking about how the pack elite measured worth only by the smooth perfection of skin and the submissive lowering of eyes, while completely ignoring the vast untapped power of those who had been tested by the fire. Remembered the suffocating weight of the palace etiquette, where she had been forced to sit quietly in the back of the grand councils, her voice entirely stifled, her brilliant ideas for defensive fortifications laughed at by arrogant pack generals who believed that wars were only won by the brute force of an alpha's chest. Here in the lonely cavern, there were no rules to restrict her movements, no judgment to dim her spark, and no dominant alphas to command her submission. She was the absolute master of her own isolated domain, reshaping the hardest elements of the natural world to fit her own unyielding will. She began to realize that her exile was not a punishment, but a grand necessary crucible that was burning away the last remnants of her fragile submissive training and leaving behind a core of pure hardened steel. The work was exhausting and lonely, often leaving her to fall asleep on a bed of dry pine needles with her face smeared with black soot and her hands throbbing with a dull ache, but she welcomed the physical exhaustion because it kept the terrifying nightmares of the fated altar away from her mind. She took pride in the neat rows of refined iron bars she stacked against the damp cavern walls, each one a silent, tangible proof of her survival. In her growing independence, she did not need a king to validate her existence or a pack bond to give her life meaning when she could create her own purpose from the very bedrock of the mountain. But the profound isolation she had cultivated so carefully over the seasons began to crack on a bitter evening When the first blizzards of the late winter began to howl through the rocky canyons, as she stood before the roaring furnace, her skin slick with sweat and her eyes fixed on a glowing bar of raw steel, a sudden unnatural vibration rippled through the stone floor beneath her heavy leather boots. It was not the familiar rhythmic thumping of the volcanic geysers or the random cracking of shifting glaciers, but a heavy, chaotic shudder that felt like the desperate panicked march of a defeated army moving up from the lowlands. Rhea froze, her hammer hovering inches above the anvil as her internal omega senses flared with a sudden sharp premonition of danger, feeling the distinct heavy resonance of a powerful alpha presence, breaching her hidden borders and tracking the scent of her smoke directly into the dark. The heavy chaotic shudder in the earth passed, leaving behind a terrifying silence, but Rhea forced her racing heart to slow and turned her attention back to the roaring furnace. She approached the crucible, where a thick slab of raw volcanic steel glowed with blinding white intensity. Most blacksmiths in the lower kingdoms use heavy iron tongs and thick leather gloves, relying on brute strength and visual guesswork to determine when the steel was ready. But Rhea possessed a secret gift that the alpha nobility could never comprehend. Her severely scarred hands, the very marks that had caused King Garrick to cast her out, were not a curse, but an extraordinary blessing. The deep burned tissue across her palms had altered her nerve endings, allowing her to read the exact thermal vibrations of the heat without being burned. She extended her bare right hand, hovering at mere inches above the blinding steel, and closed her eyes, letting the intense kinetic energy wash over her skin. She did not just see the metal, she could physically feel the internal molecular lattice structure shifting within the heat. It was a complex language of vibrations that spoke directly to her soul, telling her exactly where the stress fractures were hidden. Her scars tingled as she synchronized her breathing with the pulsing rhythm of the glowing steel, finding a perfect harmonic balance with the raw elemental power of the mountain. She knew the metal was ready because she could feel its structural submission singing against her palms. With a fluid motion, she gripped the long steel handles of the crucible and pulled the heavy glowing slab onto the ancient basalt anvil. The heat instantly blistered the damp air, turning the cavern into an absolute inferno, but Rhea did not flinch. She picked up a heavy iron mallet, her scarred muscles coiling with fierce, resilient strength, and brought the hammer down with a deafening crash. Sparks exploded across the dark cavern like a shower of falling stars, illuminating the deep shadows with brilliant flashes of golden light. Every single strike of her hammer was not a random application of brute force, but a highly calculated kinetic transfer of energy. She felt the shock waves traveling up the wooden handle, giving her a perfectly detailed map of the blade's internal integrity. She adjusted the angle of her strikes by fractions of an inch, folding the hot steel, compressing the carbon layers to create a blade that would never shatter. As the metal cooled to a dull, angry red, she continued to work with a relentless, hypnotic rhythm, her mind drifting back to the grand marble halls. She remembered the arrogant pack generals showing off their cumbersome broadswords forged by massive alpha smiths who cared only for size and weight. Those swords were brittle because their creators forced the steel into submission through sheer violence, breaking its natural lattice. Rhea forged differently, coaxing the molecules to align perfectly through patience and an incredible intuitive empathy that only a discarded omega. The hunting blade began to take shape beneath her relentless strikes, transforming into a sleek, deadly crescent of pure silvered steel. The edge was incredibly thin, yet possessed a dense structural integrity that could cut through solid bone without chipping. Rhea laid her hammer down, gripping the cooling blade with long iron pincers and thrusting it back into the heart of the furnace to equalize the temperature. This was the most dangerous part of the metallurgical process. A single mistake in the thermal transition would shatter the blade into 1,000 useless pieces. She closed her eyes, waiting for the exact microscopic moment when the carbon lattice locked into its final permanent configuration. The vibration in her palms reached a high, piercing frequency that sang through her blood. With a sudden burst of speed, she plunged the glowing sword directly into a deep stone trough filled with cold mountain spring water and volcanic ash. A massive cloud of thick white steam erupted, hissing violently as the extreme heat clashed with the freezing water. Rhea held the blade completely steady, feeling the violent thermal shock ripple through the metal, sensing the internal structure hardening into an unbreakable diamond lattice. When she pulled the blade from the water, the remaining steam rolled off to reveal a weapon of absolute breathtaking beauty. The steel was so perfectly folded that it carried a mesmerizing wave pattern, gleaming with a dark iridescent sheen. It was a physical manifestation of her own unbreakable spirit. She ran her scarred thumb gently along the flat of the blade, marveling at the perfect balance. If King Garrick could see this blade, he would be forced to beg for her forgiveness, because not a single master smith in his armory could produce a weapon of such absolute perfection. Her hands were the ultimate instruments of creation, capable of forging a power that could change the destiny of the Northern Pack. She raised the blade, feeling a deep, profound sense of pride swelling within her chest. But her moment of quiet victory was violently interrupted as the heavy chaotic shudder that she had felt earlier suddenly returned much closer and infinitely more desperate. The loose pebbles around the cavern entrance began to rattle violently against the stone floor. A massive heavy shadow fell across the opening, blocking out the pale moonlight as a low guttural alpha growl echoed through the darkness. The scent of blood ozone and pure desperation flooded into the forge, making Ri's Omega instincts scream in sheer terror. She gripped the hilt of her newly forged blade, her heart hammering frantically as the massive bloody silhouette of an alpha warrior stumbled into the light, collapsing to his knees with a deafening crash before her anvil. The massive alpha lay entirely motionless on the cold stone floor, his ragged breathing the only sound in the cavern, as a thick pool of dark blood began to slowly spread across the uneven rock. Ria stood frozen, her new blade gripped tightly in her scarred hands as the overwhelming scent of copper and burnt iron filled the stifling air. She did not step forward to examine the fallen warrior immediately because the heavy metallic scent and the roaring heat of her own furnace suddenly hijacked her senses, pulling her violently backward into a memory she had spent countless years trying to bury. She stared deeply into the blinding crimson heart of the crucible, and the flames seemed to twist and elongate, transforming into the catastrophic fire of her childhood. The damp walls of the mountain cavern melted away, and she was suddenly 8 years old, standing in the grand industrial foundry of the lower capital where her father used to serve as a low-ranking artisan for the Royal Army. The Grand Foundry was a place of immense pride and terrible danger, filled with massive hanging vats of liquid steel, suspended by thick. Ria vividly remembered the deafening roar of the massive blast furnaces and the oppressive sweltering heat that always coated her skin in a fine layer of soot and sweat. On that fateful day, a sudden catastrophic failure in the main suspension gear had sent a massive crucible swinging wildly out of control high above the main floor. Her younger sister, only 5 years old, had wandered onto the active casting floor chasing a stray village cat, completely unaware of the molten death plummeting directly toward her fragile body. Ria remembered the exact sickening sound of the rusted metal chain snapping, echoing like a cannon shot in her mind. Without a single second of hesitation or fear, she had thrown her small body forward, not to push her sister out of the way, but to catch the falling emergency release lever of a secondary containment shield. She had grabbed the scorching iron handle with both hands, forcing the heavy mechanical lever downward to drop a heavy blast door between her crying sister and the spilling river of liquid fire. The searing, agonizing pain that followed was a physical sensation so absolute and overwhelming that it still haunted her darkest waking hours. The extreme temperature of the uninsulated iron handle had instantly melted into her palms, fusing the delicate skin and tender muscle into a permanent disfiguring mass of raised burned tissue. She remembered her own agonizing screams echoing through the vast foundry as the blast door slammed shut, saving her sister but permanently destroying her own future in the strict eyes of the pack. Her father had wept bitterly as he carefully wrapped her ruined, bleeding hands in cooling herbal bandages, but the pack elders had looked down at her with cold, unyielding disgust, declaring that an Omega with such horrific deformities would never be chosen at the fated altar. Her heroic sacrifice was immediately twisted into a mark of deep shame, a physical defect that rendered her completely useless for the noble breeding traditions of the High Court. The memory burned hotly behind her eyes, a toxic mixture of profound injustice and terrifying vulnerability. She had traded her smooth, flawless skin to save a precious life, only to be brutally discarded like a piece of defective industrial slag by the very people she had bled to protect. The deafening crack of a shifting piece of coal in the present furnace violently pulled Ria out of the suffocating grip of the flashback. Her chest heaved rapidly as she dragged in ragged, desperate breaths of the damp cavern air, her scarred hands trembling violently around the hilt of her perfect sword. The fire before her was not the uncontrollable, devastating disaster of the past, but the disciplined, strictly contained heat of her own masterful creation. She was no longer the helpless, terrified child waiting for the harsh judgment of cruel alpha elders. She was the absolute master of the flame. She forced her racing heart to calm, drawing on the immense resilient strength she had meticulously built over 3 long years of brutal isolation. She slowly lowered her silver blade, her sharp hazel eyes narrowing with intense focus as she finally stepped forward to examine the massive intruder bleeding out on her sanctuary floor. The man was completely covered in thick layers of black soot and dried mud, his heavy iron armor shattered and violently dented beyond any hope of repair. But as Ria knelt cautiously beside his massive frame and gently pushed the tangled, filthy hair away from his face, her breath caught sharply in her throat. The flickering golden light of the forge revealed the pale, unconscious face of King Garrick, the very arrogant alpha who had thrown her away and gripped desperately in his lifeless armored hand was the shattered, completely broken hilt of the legendary royal. The invincible symbol of his reign was now nothing more than jagged, broken steel. Rhea stared at the man who had ruined her life, realizing with a terrifying jolt that the king who had deemed her completely useless was now entirely at her mercy, bleeding to death in the shadows of her hidden forge. She slowly raised her own perfect blade, deciding his fate. King Garrick moved restlessly through the heavy fog of his unconscious mind, his massive body shivering violently as the lingering cold of the mountain storm fought against the fierce radiant heat of the furnace. In the deep dark chambers of his soul, the Alpha King was running through a landscape of burning ash and shattered stone, watching his great kingdom fall into absolute ruin. The memory of the battle was a vivid bleeding wound in his mind, a chaotic nightmare of sound and fury, where his invincible iron vanguard had been crushed like dry leaves under the massive wheels of the southern siege engines. He could still hear the sickening sound of his legendary ancestral blade snapping in half under the weight of an enemy war mallet, a moment that had instantly broken the ancient spirit of his people and sent his proud warriors into a panicked retreat. He had fallen from the peak of sovereign arrogance to the absolute depth of human vulnerability, forced to flee into the treacherous volcanic ridges with nothing but a remnant of his broken court and the useless fragments of his shattered crown. The crushing weight of his failure was a suffocating physical presence, choking his lungs and filling his mouth with the bitter taste of defeat as he dragged his bleeding limbs through the blind white blizzard. Guided only by the faint sweet scent of volcanic wood smoke and a strange inexplicable pull in his faded blood, he had stumbled up the black paths, searching for a mythical sanctuary he did not believe existed. His inner thoughts were consumed by a deep agonizing torment, not from the physical shrapnel tearing at his chest, but from the sudden overwhelming realization of his own profound ignorance. He had spent his entire life believing that raw physical strength and traditional military dominance were the only true metrics of power in this world, looking down on those who did not possess the aggressive traits of an elite alpha warrior. He had allowed his court to become hollow and fragile, blinded by the superficial perfection of gold and smooth skin, while completely ignoring the innovative forces that were reshaping the world beyond his borders. Now, as he lay broken in the dirt, his magnificent armies were gone, his capital was burning, and the ancient bloodline of the Northern Pack was on the very brink of absolute extinction. He was a king with no throne, a commander with no soldiers, tracking a phantom scent through the freezing dark like a dying wolf looking for a place to hide its bones. The primal arrogance that had once defined his every movement had been completely burned away by the fires of the capital, leaving behind only a raw, desperate desire to preserve the innocent lives currently freezing in the high mountain passes. He groaned softly, his massive hands twitching as he reached out into the dark, empty air, searching for something solid to hold onto, something that could anchor his fading consciousness against the cold pull of death. The heavy scent of sulfur, copper, and sweet wild lavender swirled around his senses, creating a strange, comforting boundary that seemed to hold the terrifying nightmares of the invasion at bay. He could feel the gentle, firm touch of calloused hands pressing a cooling, damp cloth against his burning forehead, hands that moved with an absolute lack of fear or hesitation despite his menacing alpha aura. The touch was familiar yet entirely impossible, sending a sharp electric jolt of fated energy straight through his fractured spirit and causing his inner alpha to whine with a desperate, submissive need for protection. He struggled against the heavy weight of his eyelids, trying to force his eyes open to see the face of the mysterious savior who had pulled him from the edge of the freezing abyss, but his body refused to obey his command. He was completely trapped within the prison of his own broken flesh, forced to listen to the steady rhythmic ring of a heavy iron mallet striking hot steel somewhere in the deep shadows of the cavern. The sound was a steady, unyielding heartbeat that seemed to echo the internal resilience of the mountain itself, promising a strange, dangerous salvation that he had done not a single thing to earn. He drifted back into the warm, dark currents of sleep, his spirit clinging desperately to the sweet, unique scent of the Omega, who held his life in her scarred hands. As the hours bled into the deep stillness of the mountain night, Garrick felt his fever begin to break under the relentless care of his silent guardian. In his half-waking state, he could hear the crackle of the embers and the low, constant roar of the ventilation shafts pulling the smoke away into the peaks. He sensed the presence of someone moving with purposeful grace around the cavern, a figure that did not carry the scent of submission, but rather a scent of profound mastery and absolute independence. Every time he felt the urge to succumb to the cold shadows, the heat of the forge seemed to reach out and pull him back, as if the cavern itself was a living protective organism designed to keep him alive. He began to process the reality of his situation, realizing that he was no longer in the hands of his royal physicians or his noble attendants, but in a place of raw elemental truth. The luxury of the palace felt like a distant, fading dream, a fragile illusion that had been shattered by the first strike of a real enemy. Here in the dark heart of the volcanic peak, there were no titles to shield him and no servants to carry his burden. He was just a man facing the consequences of his own pride, while a mysterious woman worked tirelessly in the shadows to reforge the destiny of a dying realm. The rhythmic striking of the hammer continued throughout the night, a sound that acted as both a lullaby and a promise of retribution. Garrick found himself focusing entirely on that sound, using it to measure the seconds of his survival. He could feel the vibrations of the anvil traveling through the stone floor and into his weary bones, telling him that something incredible was being created in this hidden laboratory of fire. He thought of his broken sword and the deep shame that had flooded his soul when it snapped, and he wondered if the person working in the shadows could truly heal the spirit of a king whose crown had been crushed in the mud. He felt a sudden intense wave of gratitude wash over him, a feeling so alien to his alpha nature that it brought a fresh sting of tears to his closed eyes. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg for the chance to see the face of the one who had not abandoned him in the dark, but the words remained locked behind his parched lips. He could only listen and wait, hoping that the morning light would bring enough strength for him to finally confront the ghost of the woman he had once thrown away with such cold indifference. He felt the heavy warmth of a thick fur blanket being tucked around his shoulders, and the scent of lavender intensified for a brief moment before the footsteps moved back toward the glowing light of the furnace. He was a broken sovereign in a cave of ash, but for the first time in his long life he felt the true meaning of sanctuary. The pale golden light of the mountain dawn finally filtered through the thick volcanic smoke, illuminating the massive structural perfections of Rhea's hidden sanctuary. King Garrick slowly opened his eyes, his vision blurred by the lingering shadows of a terrifying fever, but his mind was instantly struck by the impossible geometric beauty of the cavern surrounding him. The natural basalt columns had been meticulously reinforced with thick bands of dark structural steel held together by massive hand-forged rivets that redirected the immense weight of the mountain overhead. It was not a mere primitive cave, it was an absolute impregnable fortress designed with an extraordinary understanding of advanced kinetic physics and defensive engineering. The ventilation shafts were perfectly calculated to pull the toxic gases away, while channeling a constant stream of fresh mountain oxygen directly into the roaring belly of the furnace. Garrick pushed himself up against the smooth stone wall, his muscles screaming with agonizing pain as his gray eyes scanned the smoke-filled room, searching for the legendary master smith who had pulled him from the frozen abyss of death. His breath caught sharply in his throat as his gaze landed on the figure standing before the blazing. Rhea stood with her back turned to him, her long dark hair braided tightly down her spine, her muscular shoulders gleaming with a fine layer of sweat and soot as she lifted a massive iron mallet with absolute flawless grace. She did not wear the delicate silk garments of the capital. She was clad in thick protective aprons of cured dragon hide, her forearms wrapped tightly in dark leather bindings. As she turned slightly to plunge a glowing piece of steel into the tempering trough, the light of the fire illuminated her profile, revealing the beautiful sharp lines of her face and the unmistakable pattern of raised black and burned tissue covering her hands. Garrick felt a sudden violent jolt of recognition strike his chest like a physical blow, his heart hammering frantically against his ribs as the memories of the fated altar came rushing back with suffocating intensity. This was Rhea, the very Omega he had publicly mocked and discarded 3 years ago because of her scarred skin. The woman he had declared completely unfit to stand beside him was now standing in absolute undisputed command of the most advanced forge he had ever witnessed in his life. The silence between them was thick and suffocating, filled only by the rhythmic hissing of the cooling steel and the steady crackle of the embers. Rhea did not look at him, her hazel eyes remaining fixed on the dark iridescent blade she held in her long iron pincer. She spoke first, her voice incredibly calm, cool, and devoid of any submissive hesitation. "You are awake. Your Majesty," she said, her tone cutting through the quiet cavern like a sharpened razor edge. "The royal physicians always said alphas were resilient, but I did not expect you to survive the shrapnel in your chest plate for more than 12 hours. Garrick struggled to find his voice, his mouth completely dry, his alpha instincts screaming at him to show submission to the incredible aura of power and expertise radiating from her form. "Rhea," he whispered, his voice breaking with a mixture of raw shock and sudden agonizing shame. "You're the legendary smith of the peaks. The one the frontier sentries whispered about. You built all of this with your own hands." Rhea finally turned her head, her sharp hazel gaze locking onto his pale face with an unyielding intensity that made the mighty king flinch. "I did," she replied, stepping closer to the light of the anvil, her scarred hands resting openly on the heavy leather apron. "When you tore my blueprints and threw me out of your grand capital, you told me that my hands were a mark of shame, that I was a broken creature who belonged in the dark. So I came to the dark, Your Majesty. I came to the places where the earth actually tests your strength instead of judging your value by the smoothness of your skin or the docility of your nature. I built this forge, I refined this volcanic ore, and I mastered the very elements that your royal armies completely failed to understand." Garrick closed his eyes, the weight of her words crushing his chest far more painfully than any enemy weapon could ever manage. He looked down at the floor, seeing the jagged, broken fragments of his ancestral sword lying uselessly in the dirt, a physical testament to the absolute failure of his old worldview. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that while he had been playing the role of an invincible conqueror in a palace of glass, Rhea had been quietly reshaping the fundamental reality of power in the mountains. She was not a submissive Omega waiting for a savior. She was the absolute sovereign of the Iron, the only person left in the entire ruined kingdom who possessed the intellect and the skill to forge a defense against the modern world. His inner thoughts were consumed by a wave of profound self-loathing as he remembered his own smug arrogance at the fated ceremony. He had allowed his kingdom to fall into ruin because of his shallow, superficial vanity, while the true savior of his people was working in absolute obscurity above the clouds. He looked back up at her, his gray eyes filled with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "Rhea, please," he managed to say, his hands trembling against the stone floor. "The capital has fallen. The enemy vanguard is tracking us through the passes. I did not come here to command you. I came here because my people are dying, and your forge is the only safe haven left in the world." Rhea raised her silver crescent blade, letting the golden firelight dance along its flawless edge. A mini cliffhanger hung in the air as a distant, terrifying boom echoed from the lower ridges, signaling that the first enemy scouts had finally arrived at the outer base of her volcanic. King Garrick lowered his head as the echo of the distant explosion died away, a profound and suffocating wave of remorse washing through his entire being. For 3 long years, his mind had been trapped in the superficial illusions of the capital, but looking at Rhea now, the absolute weight of his past arrogance crushed him completely. He remembered the exact tone of his voice on the night of the fated ceremony, the cruel, unyielding words he had hurled at her before the entire noble court, and his chest tightened with a physical agony that far surpassed the pain of his bleeding shrapnel wounds. He had looked at her scarred hands and seen only a defect, completely blind to the brilliant intellect and fierce resilience that lay beneath her skin. Now, as he sat broken and helpless on the cold stone floor of her cavern, the truth was an unyielding mirror, reflecting his own ultimate failure as a king and a mate. He watched her move around the forge with absolute disciplined efficiency, her scarred hands handling the heavy iron tools with a level of grace and authority that he had never seen in any alpha general. She did not look at him for validation, nor did she cower before his commanding alpha presence. She existed entirely outside the rigid hierarchy that had defined his world. Garrick felt a sudden intense wave of self-loathing as he realized that his own vanity had deprived his kingdom of its greatest asset, leaving his borders completely vulnerable to an innovative enemy that brute strength alone could not defeat. The legendary ancestral blade that he had carried with such immense pride was nothing more than a pile of jagged, brittle iron at her feet, a stark symbol of his outdated traditions shattering against the modern reality of warfare. He felt a sickening weight in his stomach as he admitted to himself that he had been a hollow sovereign leading his people into a trap of their own making, while the one person who possessed the keys to their survival was cast out into the freezing wilderness to die. His internal alpha, which had always demanded absolute dominance and submission from others, now felt completely broken and humbled in her presence. It was not a physical submission forced upon him by a stronger warrior, but a profound spiritual submission to her undeniable mastery and moral superiority. He looked at the vast organized laboratory she had carved out of the solid rock and felt incredibly small, a transient ghost passing through an enduring monument of her unyielding willpower. The silence between them was thick with unsaid apologies and the heavy scent of burning coal, a slow burn tension humming in the air, as their fated bond tried to bridge the massive chasm created by his past. Garrick reached out, his fingers trembling as he brushed the cold fractured metal of his broken hilt, his voice barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "I was entirely blind. Rhea," he said, his gray eyes shining with an intense, raw vulnerability that he had never shown to another living soul. "I looked at the fire that had tested you and I called it a weakness when it was actually the very thing that made you unbreakable. I allowed my pride to ruin our people, and I have absolutely no right to ask for your mercy, but I'm begging you to save them." He watched her profile, hoping for even a flicker of acknowledgement, but her features remained as rigid and beautiful as the volcanic basalt surrounding them. The realization that he had permanently broken her trust was a physical torment tearing at his chest far more violently than the iron shrapnel. He wanted to scream against the injustice of his own past actions, to tear down the memory of the fated altar, but he knew that words were completely cheap and meaningless in the face of her years of silent suffering. He could see the fine layers of ash coating her powerful shoulders, and he realized that every single bar of refined iron in this cavern represented a day of lonely, backbreaking labor that she had endured because of his cruel judgment. He had sentenced her to a slow death in the freezing peaks, but she had turned her execution into a grand secret empire of technological advancement. The contrast between his current shattered state and her absolute self-sufficient sovereignty was an absolute testament to the theme of the powerless becoming the ultimate arbiter of fate. He closed his eyes, letting his forehead rest against the cool, damp stone floor, totally relinquishing his royal dignity before her anvil. He was no longer King Garrick, the invincible protector of the North. He was just a broken man pleading for a second chance from the woman he had treated like worthless industrial waste. He felt the heavy warmth of the forge pulsing against his skin, a heat that felt less like a physical temperature and more like the fierce cleansing fire of her judgment. He accepted the pain, willingly finding a strange, desperate comfort in the fact that she had not immediately executed him or thrown him out into the blizzard. His inner thoughts twisted with a desperate hope that he could somehow earn her respect, not as a sovereign commanding an inferior, but as a companion willing to learn from her superior wisdom. He knew the path to redemption would be long, agonizing, and filled with the bitter taste of his own past arrogance, but he was entirely ready to crawl through the hot coals of her forge to it. Rhea stood perfectly still by the anvil, her hazel gaze locked onto the glowing embers, her face unreadable, as the mini cliffhanger of the approaching enemy vanguard grew closer with every passing heartbeat. She slowly raised her heavy iron hammer, her muscles tightening as she looked down at his bowing form, her silent stance leaving his fate hanging by a single fraying thread of molten steel. Rhea did not allow King Garrick to remain bowing in the dirt for long, because she had absolutely no use for empty royal guilt when an invading army was currently tracking his bloodline up her mountain. She reached down with a firm, unyielding grip, grabbing the heavy leather straps of his dented chestplate and forcing him back to his feet with a strength that made his alpha senses tingle with absolute shock. "If you truly wish to save your people, then stand up and make yourself useful," she commanded, her voice echoing with the fierce authority of the forge itself. "I do not need your tears. Your Majesty, I need a pair of arms that can pull a heavy bellows handle without fainting from a few broken ribs." Garrick did not hesitate for a single second, his sovereign pride completely evaporating as he stepped forward to take his place at the rear of the furnace, gripping the massive wooden levers of the twin leather bellows. Under Rhea's strict cinematic guidance, the Broken King became a common apprentice, his massive muscles straining as he pumped a continuous stream of oxygen into the heart of the coals, causing the white heat to explode into a brilliant, blinding symphony of light that illuminated the entire cavern. Rhea stood at the center of this inferno, her scarred hands moving with a mesmerizing poetic grace as she used her thermal intuition to coordinate the melt. She threw the shattered fragments of the ancient ancestral sword directly into a massive black graphite crucible, mixing the old royal steel with a precise calculated percentage of her own refined volcanic iron and rare cobalt deposits. The slow burn romance between them did not manifest in soft words or traditional touches, but in the intense rhythmic synchronization of their physical labor. Every time Garrick pumped the bellows to raise the heat, Rhea met his movement with a flawless strike of her hammer, creating a beautiful fluid dialogue of muscle heat and iron that filled the dark cave with a magnificent primal energy. Garrick watched her through the heavy waves of shimmering heat, his heart swelling with a deep, profound respect that was infinitely more powerful than the instinctual pulling of their fated bond. He saw how she read the vibrations of the liquid steel with her bare, scarred palms, adjusting the alloy proportions by fractions of a millimeter based entirely on the internal kinetic feedback of the material. She was not just melting metal, she was completely rewriting the structural laws of their kingdom, blending the traditional purity of the royal line with the resilient, unyielding strength of the Forgotten Mountain. The physical proximity between them was electrifying, filled with the raw scent of sweat, sulfur, and wild lavender that swirled around the anvil like a protective boundary against the cold world outside. Garrick could feel the fierce, independent spirit of the Omega radiating from her skin, a power so absolute that it made his own alpha aura feel entirely hollow and secondary. He realized that she did not need his crown, his protection, or his validation to be complete. She was already a perfect, self-sufficient sovereign of her own domain, and he was merely a guest being allowed to witness her greatness. As the hours passed in this intense collaborative exile, the heavy barrier of hostility between them began to soften, replaced by a profound, wordless understanding that was forged through the shared agony of the fire. Rhea watched the muscles in his back knot and strain with exhaustion, but she did not tell him to stop because she knew that this physical labor was the only way for him to burn away the last remnants of his past arrogance. They worked side by side through the deep stillness of the mountain night, their movements becoming so perfectly aligned that they seemed to breathe as a single organism, moving to the steady thumping heartbeat of the volcanic geysers below. Garrick found himself adjusting his pace to match the rise and fall of her shoulders, learning to anticipate the exact moment she needed more air in the furnace or a specific tool passed to her scarred hands. There was a beautiful unspoken harmony in their efforts, a silent restructuring of their entire dynamic where the Alpha willingly placed himself under the direction of the Omega. He noticed the tiny details of her movements, the way her jaw tightened before a heavy strike, the way her hazel eyes flashed with absolute genius when the alloy reached its perfect color. He felt a deep protective instinct rising within him, but it was no longer the patronizing pity of a superior being. It was the fierce, loyal devotion of a warrior standing beside his true equal. The glowing blade began to take form within the liquid matrix, a sleek, deadly masterpiece of advanced kinetics that was being born from the literal destruction of his old world. Rhea poured the liquid metal into the sand mold with an absolute steady hand, her focus so intense that she seemed entirely insulated from the freezing wind outside. Garrick wiped the sweat from his eyes watching the dark smoke rise from the cooling channel, feeling that they were not just making a weapon but forging a whole new covenant for their survival. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. The air in the cavern grew heavy with the sweet scent of success, but their quiet sanctuary of creation was violently shattered as a heavy steel bolt from an enemy ballista suddenly tore through the stone entrance of the cave, throwing a massive shower of jagged rock fragments. The mini cliffhanger hung heavily in the air as Rhea held the glowing crucible suspended over the mold, her hazel eyes narrowing as the dark silhouettes of the enemy vanguard finally appeared at the smoking threshold of her forge, their cold iron armor gleaming with a murderous intent in the fading moonlight. The thick stone threshold of the cavern erupted into a violent shower of sparks and black dust as the advanced scouting party of the Southern Iron Empire forced their way through the narrow entrance, their massive heavy crossbows cocked and aimed directly at the heart of the forge. 3 elite enemy vanguard troopers stood in the smoke, clad in dense overlapping plates of dark mechanized armor that bore the cruel sigil of the Southern conquering house. They did not carry traditional shields. Instead, their forearms were fitted with heavy spring-loaded kinetic bucklers, designed to deflect the brute force swinging attacks of traditional Northern alphas. Rhea did not drop her long iron pincers, nor did she step back into the shadows of the furnace. She stood her ground before her basalt anvil, her hazel eyes narrowing into 2 slits of cold, calculated fury as she evaluated the structural vulnerabilities of the invaders' equipment. Because Garrick instantly dropped the heavy wooden handles of the bellows, his raw alpha instincts flaring with a defensive violence that made the lead Southern trooper let out a harsh metallic laugh that echoed unnervingly through the high arches of the cavern, his hand lifting to raise a heavy repeating ballista that glowed with a faint, unnatural blue energy. "Look what we have found hiding in the crags, boys," the scout sneered, his voice distorted by the heavy iron grate of his combat helmet as his cold gaze flicked from Garrick's ruined royal armor to the glowing crucible resting on the sand mold. The great Alpha King of the North, reduced to playing a servant girl's apprentice in a hole of ash and sulfur. The High Command thought you had died in the lower ravines, but it seems you just ran away to hide behind an ugly, deformed Omega. The insult hung heavily in the air, thick and toxic, but it did not provoke the reaction the soldier expected. Garrick did not roar in blind rage, nor did he charge forward with the reckless arrogance that had characterized his old military tactics. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the enemy's stance, his weight distributed evenly across his heels, exactly as Rhea had taught him during their hours of synchronized labor at the furnace. Rhea spoke from behind him, her voice low, cool, and entirely devoid of any fear, carrying a level of scientific authority that cut through the tension like a diamond saw through soft copper. The locking pins on their shoulder guards are made of cast pig iron, not tempered steel. She whispered to Garrick, her words meant only for his ears, as she subtly shifted her position to reach for her newly forged silver crescent blade. "If you strike them at a 45-degree angle from the top down, the entire breastplate will collapse under its own kinetic feedback." Garrick gave a microscopic nod of his head, his body completely relaxed despite the agonizing throbbing of his unhealed shrapnel wounds, his spirit feeling a profound, unprecedented sense of security because he was no longer fighting for his own superficial vanity, but as the trusted instrument of her brilliant design. Before the lead trooper could pull the mechanical trigger of his ballista, Garrick exploded forward with a fluid, explosive speed that completely defied his massive size, his boots kicking up a cloud of black volcanic sand that temporarily blinded the secondary scouts. The combat that followed was a magnificent, brutal demonstration of the new order they had forged together in the wilderness. The lead scout fired a heavy steel bolt that hissed through the air, but Garrick sidestepped the projectile by fractions of an inch, the wind of its passage tearing a shallow groove across his cheek as he closed the distance in a single heartbeat. He did not have a sword, but he possessed the raw, hardened power of a warrior who had been lifting heavy iron mallets for hours under Reese's unyielding direction. He brought his massive fist down in a terrifying hammer fist strike directly onto the lead trooper's left shoulder guard, targeting the exact structural vulnerability Rhea had pointed out. The pig iron locking pin shattered instantly with a loud metallic crack, and the massive heavy breastplate collapsed inward under the force of the kinetic transfer, crushing the soldier's collarbone and sending him crashing to the stone floor with a groan of absolute agony. The remaining two scouts let out panicked roars, their traditional tactical training completely failing them as they realized that the Northern King was no longer fighting like a predictable brute force alpha, but with a calculated precision that was entirely alien to their intelligence reports. They drew their heavy short swords, moving in a coordinated pincer movement to trap Garrick against the side of the cooling trough, their blades whistling through the damp air in a series of rapid intersecting cuts. Garrick parried the first strike with his reinforced leather arm braces, the metal rivets sparking violently against the enemy's steel, but the secondary scout found an opening, lunging directly for his exposed unarmored flank, but the blow never landed. Rhea moved like a shadow through the smoke, her silver crescent blade slicing through the darkness with a high, beautiful hum that sounded like a physical song of retribution. With a single flawless sweeping motion that combined the perfect balance of her new weapon with the hardened muscle of her shoulders, she cut clean through the secondary trooper's mechanical crossbow mount, the hardened volcanic steel separating the thick iron tubes as easily as if they were made of soft tallow. The scout stared in absolute horror at his severed weapon before Rhea stepped inside his guard, the flat of her heavy blade striking his helmet with a concussive force that knocked him completely unconscious into the black sand. The final remaining trooper backed away toward the cave entrance, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps as he looked from the massive, unyielding king to the beautiful, soot-smeared Omega, who held a weapon of such impossible technological perfection that it defied everything his empire knew about metallurgy. He turned to flee, to carry the terrifying news of their survival back to the main army. But Garrick lunged forward, grabbing the heavy iron collar of his armor and slamming him violently against the basalt column, stripping him of his communications gear in a matter of seconds. The immediate threat was neutralized, the dark cavern falling back into a heavy breathing silence filled only by the scent of ozone and fresh blood. A mini cliffhanger hung in the air as Rhea wiped her blade on her leather apron, her eyes locking onto the captured enemy map that had fallen from the trooper's belt, revealing that a massive battalion of 500 iron soldiers was already marching directly toward their hidden ridge. The echo of the battle dissolved into the deep recesses of the cavern, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the two remaining victors. Rhea did not waste a single second celebrating their survival or examining her pristine blade. Her practical scientific mind immediately pivoted to the massive strategic crisis laid bare before them on the stone floor. She stepped over the unconscious bodies of the Southern scouts, her heavy leather boots crunching against the scattered fragments of broken pig iron, and knelt beside the captured tactical map that had slipped from the lead trooper's belt. The parchment was not made of traditional animal hide, but a strange, waterproof synthetic material used by the Southern Empire's engineering corps, marked with highly precise topographical lines and glowing chemical inks that mapped the volcanic peaks with terrifying accuracy. Garrick moved to stand directly behind her, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the glowing document as he wiped a mixture of sweat and dark blood from his brow. His gray eyes, which had spent a lifetime reading the traditional battlefield maps of the Old Kingdom, narrowed in absolute horror as he deciphered the complex geometric symbols overlapping the mountain passes. It was not a mere hunting party or a simple tracking patrol that was heading their way. The glowing red indicators clearly detailed the movement of a massive, fully integrated iron battalion consisting of 500 elite frontline heavy infantry accompanied by several mobile mechanical ballista units capable of leveling a small fortress in a single afternoon. The vanguard had not been looking for a random cave. They were systematically clearing the entire ridgeline, and the thick black smoke from Rhea's forge had served as a perfect beacon, guiding their main destruction force directly toward this hidden coordinates. The realization of their absolute vulnerability settled into the damp air like a heavy physical weight. 500 technologically advanced soldiers against a broken king and an exiled Omega was not a battle. It was a total, unyielding execution. Garrick felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach as he looked around the magnificent self-contained sanctuary that Rhea had spent 3 lonely years building from the raw bedrock of the mountain. Every reinforced basalt column, every hand-forged rivet, and every perfectly calculated ventilation shaft was about to be pulverized into worthless gray dust by the overwhelming kinetic force of the Southern Empire's modern siege engines. He had brought this destruction to her doorstep through his own weakness, tracking his failure up her mountain and exposing her secret empire to the very cruelty she had fled so long ago. Rhea tapped her scarred index finger against the glowing center of the map, her hazel eyes completely calm, cool, and analytical, showing absolutely no sign of the panic that threatened to consume the mighty king beside her. "They are moving in a tight, concentrated column through the Black Gorge," she said, her voice carrying the steady, rhythmic cadence of a master architect explaining a blueprint. The Southern commanders rely entirely on their rigid technological formations and their heavy mechanical armor to absorb frontal impacts. They believe that because they have crushed your traditional alpha vanguard, there is no force left in these mountains capable of breaking their advance. But their mechanical superiority is also their ultimate structural flaw. They are too heavy, too predictable, and they do not understand the internal kinetic energy of the mountain they are currently marching. Garrick looked at her, his heart hammering against his ribs with a profound, intoxicating mixture of raw shock and sudden desperate hope. "What are you thinking, Rhea?" he asked, his voice naturally dropping into a tone of absolute submission to her superior strategic intellect. "There are 500 of them fully armored and supported by heavy artillery. Even with your perfect silver crescent blade and my physical strength, we cannot face an entire battalion in open combat. We would be cut to pieces before we could even breach their front rank." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Rast's soot-smeared face, a sharp, dangerous expression that illuminated the shadows of the cave far more intensely than the glowing coals of her furnace. "I have absolutely no intention of fighting them in open combat, Your Majesty," she replied, rising to her full height and turning her back on the map to face the deep, dark chasm at the rear of her forge. "You alphas always believe that wars are won by the size of your chests and the weight of your swords. You think of power as an external thing to be swung at an enemy. But true power is the precise manipulation of energy, heat, and structural balance. This mountain is not a passive pile of stone. It is a pressurized volcanic vessel held together by specific tectonic faults. For 3 years, I have been studying the seismic vibrations of these sulfurous fissures while refining my ironstone." She walked toward a heavy reinforced wooden crate hidden in the darkest corner of the cavern, lifting the thick lid to reveal rows of dense heavy spheres forged from dark, brittle cast iron, each one fitted with a primitive chemical fuse packed with highly concentrated volcanic sulfur and pressurized charcoal dust. "I didn't just build a forge up here, Garrick. I built a laboratory of advanced demolition physics," she whispered, her hazel eyes flashing with a terrifying, beautiful genius. "The Black Gorge is a natural kinetic bottleneck. The cliff faces are composed of highly fractured basalt stone held under immense structural tension by the freezing winter ice. If we place these pressure charges at the exact molecular stress points along the lower ridge, a single coordinated kinetic impact will cause the entire mountain wall to shear away, creating a catastrophic rockslide that will bury their entire 500-man battalion under 10,000 tons of unyielding volcanic slate before they can even reload their ballistas." Garrick stared at the dark iron spheres, his mind reeling as the sheer magnificent scale of her innovative military science completely dismantled every traditional concept of warfare he had ever been taught by his arrogant generals. She was not planning a defense, she was planning an absolute engineering massacre. But her brilliant explanation was violently cut short as a sudden, massive tremor rippled through the stone floor, far more violent than the previous explosions. The mini cliffhanger hung heavily in the air as a low, terrifying mechanical roar echoed from the lower mouth of the gorge, signaling that the Southern Battalion's heavy siege engines had just entered the base of the ridge, their massive iron wheels beginning their final relentless ascent toward her hidden home. The terrifying mechanical roar of the heavy siege engines vibrated through the bedrock, signaling that their time had completely run out. Rhea did not falter. She immediately galvanized into a blur of absolute calculated motion. She began loading the dense, heavy pressure charges into a pair of reinforced leather satchels, her scarred hands moving with the practiced rhythm of a master artisan who knew the precise weight and volatile nature of every single grain of sulfur in her possession. Garrick did not ask questions. He stepped forward into the dim light of the furnace, throwing the heavy straps over his massive, unarmored shoulders and lifting the immense weight of the demolition gear without a single murmur of complaint. He had completely shed the skin of his former royal arrogance, transforming himself into the ultimate physical instrument of her brilliant, unconventional strategy. They slipped out of the narrow cavern opening into the blind, biting white darkness of the mountain blizzard, leaving behind the protective warmth of the forge to enter a world of freezing wind and treacherous, black. The storm was an absolute tempest, the howling gales threatening to rip the heavy leather bags straight from their shoulders as they began their perilous, rapid descent down the steep, icy ridges toward the absolute mouth of the Black Gorge. Rhea led the way through the shifting snow, her unique physical connection to the thermal and kinetic vibrations of the mountain, allowing her to navigate the invisible paths with an uncanny, flawless precision that no traditional Alpha Scout could ever hope to replicate. She could feel the structural groaning of the ice-choked crags beneath her heavy boots, reading the deep internal stress lines of the stone like a detailed map laid out before her sharp hazel eyes. Garrick followed her closely through the freezing dark, his massive frame acting as a natural physical shield against the most violent gusts of the wind, his gray eyes constantly scanning the lower ravines for any. The physical exertion was absolute agony, his unhealed shrapnel wounds throbbing violently with every single step he took down the jagged cliffside. but his mind was consumed by a deep, overriding sense of protective devotion that left absolutely no room for personal weakness. He watched the fierce, independent Omega battle the elements before him, her dark hair whipping wildly in the blizzard, and he realized with absolute clarity that he would gladly march straight into the fires of the underworld if she were the one directing his path. The traditional boundaries of their old world had completely melted away in the storm. They were no longer a sovereign and an exile, but a singular, perfectly synchronized force of nature fighting for the survival of their culture. As they finally reached the high, precipitous ridges, overlooking the narrow bottleneck of the Black Gorge, the terrifying reality of the southern military machine materialized in the darkness below them. The entire canyon floor was a winding, glowing river of absolute destruction, illuminated by the harsh chemical blue light of the enemy's advanced tactical lanterns. 500 elite iron troopers marched in a dense, impregnable turtle formation, their heavy mechanized armor clicking and groaning in unison as they moved through the deep snow like a massive, multi-legged metallic serpent. At the center of their rigid column rolled three massive, mobile mechanical ballistas, their enormous iron wheels tearing deep, ugly scars into the pristine white valley as their heavy steel launching arms stood cocked and ready to unleash their devastating kinetic payload upon the peaks. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the invading force was a visual testament to the absolute death of the old ways. It was a modern industrial monster that could never be stopped by common steel or blind alpha courage. Rhea knelt at the very edge of the icy precipice, her bare, scarred right palm pressing firmly against the frozen surface of the primary basalt pillar that formed the structural foundation of the entire western cliff. She closed her eyes, ignoring the freezing cold that instantly bit into her skin, and let her extraordinary nerve endings read the deep subterranean frequencies of the mountain. She could feel the immense weight of the overhanging volcanic slate held under terrifying, unstable structural tension by the expanding winter ice within the fissures. It was a perfect, highly volatile kinetic equilibrium that required only a precise, localized application of energy to completely collapse inward upon the gorge below. Here, she whispered through the howling wind, her hazel eyes snapping open with an intense, brilliant focus as she pointed to a deep, jagged fracture line running down the base of the column. This is the primary structural pivot point of the entire ridge. If we plant the first 3 pressure charges directly into this fissure and detonate them simultaneously, the kinetic shockwave will shear the entire basalt wall away along its molecular fault lines. Garrick immediately knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands working in absolute harmony with her directions as he carefully jammed the heavy iron spheres deep into the dark, narrow opening of the rock. He used his immense physical strength to wedge them securely against the internal stone faces, ensuring that the maximum amount of explosive energy would be directed inward into the mountain's core rather than escaping into the open air. Rhea pulled a pair of chemical slow matches from her leather apron, linking the primitive fuses of the 3 charges together with a precise, calculated length of treated cord that would allow them exactly 60 seconds to retreat to a safe distance before the catastrophic detonation. The proximity of the enemy was suffocatingly close now. They could hear the loud, rhythmic clanking of the southern armor echoing up the cliffside, the lead scouts already beginning to scale the lower paths that led directly to their position. The slow burn tension between the two reached an absolute electrifying peak as they finished securing the final pressure charge at the secondary fault line across the ridge. Garrick looked at Rhea through the swirling snow, his features softened by a deep, profound respect that was infinitely more powerful than the fated bond humming in their blood. "If this works, Rhea, you will have done what my entire grand army could not achieve," he said, his voice raw with an unyielding sincerity that carried no trace of his past royal pride. "You're the true protector of this realm." Rhea met his intense gaze, her expression unreadable but her hazel eyes softening by a fraction of an inch as she handed him the flint striker. "We save our people first, Your Majesty, then we discuss who protects whom," she replied, her cool tone carrying a hidden spark of dark, resilient humor. A mini cliffhanger hung heavily in the freezing air as Garrick struck the flint, a bright shower of golden sparks instantly igniting the chemical fuse, which began to hiss violently as it raced downward into the dark heart of the unyielding stone, while the first southern searchlights suddenly cut through the blizzard, illuminating their positions on the high ridge. The harsh, chemical blue searchlights of the southern vanguard locked onto the high ridge, cutting through the blinding snow and pinning Rhea and Garrick in their brilliant accusatory glare. Shouts of alarm erupted from the canyon floor below as the enemy commanders realized they were not looking at random mountain wildlife, but at the missing Northern King and a lone Omega standing directly above their primary advance line. Heavy repeating ballistas on the mobile siege engines began to groan, their massive iron gears grinding violently as the engineers frantically worked to elevate the launching arms toward the precipice. Rhea did not freeze. She grabbed the strap of Garrick's leather harness and yanked him backward into the shadows just as a massive steel bolt tore through the air, obliterating the very stone ledge they had been standing on only a heartbeat before. The chemical fuse hissed with a terrifying rhythmic intensity, eating through the treated cord as a bright trail of green sparks raced downward into the dark fissure where the pressure charges were wedged. "Run," Garrick bellowed, his voice easily cutting through the roar of the blizzard as he threw his massive arm around Reese's waist, using his remaining physical strength to propel both of them up the steep, slippery incline of the volcanic ridge. The 60-second countdown was a physical torment in their chests, their lungs burning with the freezing mountain air as they scrambled over jagged blocks of frozen basalt, desperately searching for a structural dead zone that would shield them from the imminent kinetic shockwave. Behind them, the Southern Scouts were already scrambling up the lower paths with terrifying speed, their mechanized armor clicking and hissing as they fired their hand ballistas into the blinding white dark. The universe seemed to contract into a single, breathless second of absolute silence as the green spark finally vanished into the heart of the primary stone column. Then, the mountain spoke. It was not a standard explosion of fire and smoke, but a deep, subterranean thud that vibrated through the absolute marrow of their bones. A pure, highly concentrated kinetic transfer of energy that delivered an impossible shockwave directly into the molecular fault lines of the basalt wall. Rhea, pressed tightly against Garrick's chest behind a massive natural rock outcropping, watched with an architect's absolute detachment as her calculations manifested in physical reality. The 3 pressure charges detonated in perfect microsecond synchronization, creating an overlapping harmonic frequency that instantly shattered the internal ice holding the fissures together. A long, jagged line of brilliant white pressure dust shot out across the entire western cliff face, tracing a perfect 45-degree angle along the mountain's structural pivot point. For a fraction of a second, the massive wall of volcanic slate remained entirely motionless, suspended by the sheer weight of its own historical permanence. Then, with a deafening, apocalyptic roar that sounded like the earth itself tearing in half, the entire western side of the Black Gorge sheared away from the main ridge. 10,000 tons of unyielding, solid volcanic rock lost its structural equilibrium simultaneously, collapsing inward upon the canyon floor with a terrifying, catastrophic momentum that completely defied description. The dense, pristine white snow of the ravine was instantly swallowed by a roaring, suffocating tidal wave of black stone and pulverized gray dust that rushed down the mountain like a physical manifestation of divine retribution. Below them, the absolute confidence of the Southern military machine vanished into a state of total, unmitigated terror in a matter of heartbeats. The elite Iron Troopers trapped within their rigid, heavy turtle formations could do absolutely nothing to escape the descending mountain. Their advanced mechanized armor, designed to absorb the predictable, brute force swinging attacks of traditional northern alphas, was completely useless against the chaotic, crushing weight of a collapsing mountain ridge. The massive mobile mechanical ballistas were the first to be obliterated, their enormous iron wheels and advanced steel launching arms crushed like fragile glass under the immense impact of the falling basalt boulders. The harsh chemical blue lanterns were systematically extinguished as the massive river of black rock swept through the bottleneck, burying the entire 500-man battalion under an impenetrable, permanent tomb of unyielding volcanic slate. The cataclysmic roar finally subsided into a series of fading, echoing rumbles that traveled down the lower valleys, leaving behind an absolute, terrifying silence that was far more profound than the storm itself. A massive, thick cloud of gray dust rolled up the ridges, coating Rhea and Garrick in a fine layer of ash as they slowly rose from behind their protective stone outcropping to look down at the gorge. The winding, glowing river of destruction that had threatened to extinguish their entire culture was completely gone, replaced by a massive smoking field of shattered black rock that stretched from one side of the canyon. A single, innovative engineering strategy had achieved in less than 2 minutes what the entire Grand Army of the Northern Capital could not accomplish in weeks of traditional bloody warfare. Garrick stared down at the obliterated canyon, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as his mind struggled to process the sheer magnificent scale of the victory he had just witnessed. He looked at the smoking debris, then turned his gaze slowly toward Rhea, who stood beside him with her silver crescent blade resting against her hip, her sharp hazel eyes scanning the ruin with a cool, undisturbed satisfaction. The absolute truth of the new world was written in the dust before him. The traditional strength of the Alphas was dead, and the future of the realm belonged entirely to the intellect and resilience of the Omega they had cast away. A mini cliffhanger hung heavily in the freezing air as a sudden sharp flare of light caught Garrick's eye from the far end of the ridge, revealing a small group of surviving northern refugees emerging from their terrified eyes wide with shock as they realized their king was alive and standing beside the mythical master smith of the peaks. The thick gray cloud of pulverized stone slowly began to settle over the obliterated gorge, coating the fresh fields of volcanic debris in a silent, uniform shroud of ash. From the upper crags of the mountain, a small, shivering group of northern pack refugees began to trickle down into the high ridges, their ragged garments torn by the blizzard and their faces hollowed by weeks of absolute terror. Among them were low-ranking artisans, nurses from the lower districts, and a few bloodied, weaponless soldiers who had survived the initial slaughter at the capital. They stopped dead in their tracks as they reached the perimeter of the ridge, their wide, exhausted eyes darting from the smoking wasteland of the canyon below to the two figures standing clad in soot and firelight at the threshold of the hidden forge. A collective gasp of disbelief rippled through the weary crowd as they recognized the massive scarred frame of King Garrick. He was alive, but the sight of their sovereign brought no wave of traditional submissive relief. Instead, it filled them with a profound, disorienting shock. The invincible Alpha King was not standing at the head of a glittering vanguard, nor was he issuing commands from a golden chariot. He was standing half-step behind Rhea, his gray eyes fixed on her with a fierce, unyielding devotion that completely rewrote the ancient social laws of their culture. And before him stood Rhea, the broken Omega. They had all watched the High Court discard like useless slag, holding a flawless silver crescent blade that gleamed with the unmistakable light of advanced technological genius. Garrick stepped forward into the center of the ridge, his deep voice carrying across the freezing wind, stripped entirely of its past royal arrogance and filled instead with a raw, resonant humility. "My people," he called out, his hand lifting not to point toward his own shattered crown, but to gesture openly toward the beautiful soot-smeared woman beside him. "The old kingdom has fallen, and the traditions we worshipped have left us bleeding in the snow. We survived this night not because of the strength of our alphas or the lineage of our blood, but because of the brilliant intellect and unyielding spirit of the one we cast away. The capital is gone, but the future of our people begins here, in the heart of this mountain under the guidance of the Master." A heavy, breathless silence fell over the refugees as they looked at Rhea's scarred hands, realizing with a sudden, overwhelming wave of collective remorse that the very person they had deemed completely useless was now the absolute arbiter of their survival. Slowly, without a single word or command being issued, an elderly nurse from the lower capital dropped to her knees in the freezing snow, her head bowing in deep voluntary reverence to the exiled Omega. One by one, the bloodied vanguard soldiers and the weary artisans followed her example, their traditional alpha pride completely evaporating as they relinquished the old social hierarchy before the undeniable majesty of her achievement. They were not bowing to a royal title or a breeding tradition. They were bowing to the raw, self-sufficient sovereignty of the iron. Rhea looked out over the sea of bowing figures, her sharp hazel eyes remaining completely calm, cool, and analytical. She felt no petty desire for personal vengeance or hollow satisfaction in their submission. Her practical mind was already calculating the logistics required to house, feed, and organize an entire resistance movement within the deep volcanic chambers of her sanctuary. She stepped up onto a high basalt block, her silver blade catching the first true rays of the morning sun as she looked down at her new people. "Stand up," she commanded, her voice cutting through the wind with the fierce, absolute authority of the forge itself. "I have no use for your bowing or your guilt. If you wish to survive the winter and reclaim our lands from the Southern Iron Empire, you will drop your outdated pride and pick up a mallet. In this forge, there are no kings, no omegas, and no elites. There is only the iron and the strength we are about to build together." Garrick watched her, a slow, profound smile breaking through the soot on his face as his heart swelled with an intense, slow-burn romance that had been completely purified by the fires of their collaborative exile. He stepped beside her, his massive shoulder brushing against hers in a silent, permanent covenant of absolute equality. He was no longer a ruler commanding an inferior, but a loyal partner ready to serve as the physical shield for her brilliant, innovative mind. The theme of the powerless becoming the ultimate savior of the realm had achieved its absolute, cinematic manifestation in the White Mountain air. A mini cliffhanger hung heavily over the new colony as Rhea turned back toward the entrance of her roaring forge, her hand tightening around the hilt of her perfect sword as a massive column of black smoke rose into the sky, signaling to the entire world that a new, unyielding empire of technology and resilience had just been born from the ashes of the old world. The transition from a chaotic survival crisis to a structured resistance camp happened with the disciplined efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Within 48 hours of the landslide, Rhea's hidden sanctuary had become the bustling subterranean heart of a new society. She did not allow the refugees time to mourn their lost luxuries or wallow in collective guilt. Instead, she organized the entire population into specific labor guilds based entirely on their practical skills and physical capacities, completely ignoring the old caste laws that had separated the elite alphas from the lower caste omegas. The great marble fortresses of the capital were gone, replaced by the dark, echoing basalt galleries of the volcanic peak, where every single citizen was required to earn their keep through the sweat of their brow and the precision of their hands. Garrick adjusted to his new role as the chief coordinator of physical logistics with a quiet, unyielding determination that earned him a new kind of respect from his remaining people. He no longer wore the golden ornamental armor of his kingship. Instead, he was clad in a simple, heavy leather smithing apron and dark woolen tunics, his massive muscles straining daily as he carried raw iron ore from the deep mining shafts to the primary crushing stations. He took his orders directly from Rhea without a single moment of hesitation or prideful resistance, acting as the ultimate physical executor of her brilliant structural blueprints. The slow burn romance between them deepened through this mutual immersion in hard, practical labor, their fated bond transforming from a wild instinctual pulling into a profound, unshakable partnership built on shared survival and absolute intellectual alignment. The cavern air was thick with the scent of burning coal, pulverized slate, and wild mountain lavender as the first major production cycle began under Rhea's strict, innovative direction. She stood on the central catwalk overlooking the main furnace floor, her sharp hazel eyes scanning the lines of workers who were learning to refine the volcanic iron using her advanced chemical formulas. She noticed that a group of former Royal Guardsmen still clinging to their traditional alpha training were attempting to forge new broadswords using the ancient, outdated methods of the capital, focusing entirely on massive weight and ornamental hilts. She descended the iron stairs with a swift, purposeful stride, her heavy boots clicking against the metal grate as she stopped directly in front of their anvil, her silver crescent blade resting openly against her hip. If you forge your weapons with that traditional thickness, the Southern kinetic war mallets will shatter them into 1,000 pieces before you can even finish your first swing, Rhea stated, her cool analytical voice cutting through the heavy thumping of the hammers. The guardsmen flinched, their faces flushing with a mixture of residual pride and sudden embarrassment as they looked from her scarred hands to the crude, brittle steel they had been shaping. Rhea reached down, grabbing a piece of their refined alloy with her iron pincers and placing it flat on the primary anvil. Modern military science demands flexibility, not just brute mass. You must layer the high-carbon volcanic iron with a softer cobalt-rich core to absorb the impact of advanced ballistics. Watch me. Garrick moved into position behind the furnace bellows at her exact, unspoken cue, pumping a steady, powerful stream of oxygen into the coals to raise the temperature to the precise white-hot matrix she required. The refugees gathered around the central forge in a silent, captivated circle, watching as the master smith and their former king moved in a flawless, mesmerizing synchronization that had become the heartbeat of the entire company. Rhea's hammer came down with an absolute mathematical precision, each strike folding the different layers of metal together at perfect, calculated angles that redistributed the internal molecular stress points. She was not just teaching them how to make weapons, she was completely reprogramming their brains to understand the true nature of power, demonstrating that innovation and intellect were the only metrics of survival in a changing world. By the time the sun began to set behind the jagged volcanic peaks, the first crate of the new layered kinetic short swords was completed, their sleek, dark, iridescent blades representing a total revolution in northern military technology. The former guardsmen picked up the new weapons, their eyes wide with absolute awe as they felt the incredible lightness and perfect balance of the steel, realizing that these flexible blades could easily withstand the devastating impact of the southern siege engine. The social fabric of the camp was changing rapidly, the old hierarchies melting away in the heat of the furnace as the artisans and omegas who possessed high technical aptitude became the new leaders and teachers of the community, while the proud alphas willingly served as the physical backbone of the industrial machine. As the night deepened, the heavy thumping of the volcanic geysers below the floor provided a comforting, rhythmic baseline for the sleeping camp. Rhea sat at her small, reinforced wooden desk near the rear of the laboratory, her fingers tracing the intricate geometric lines of a new blueprint for a stationary kinetic ballista defense system that would completely secure the mountain passes against future invasion. Garrick approached her silently, carrying a wooden tray with a cup of hot mountain herb tea, his gray eyes softened by an intense protective devotion as he placed the offering beside her inkwell. He did not speak, refusing to interrupt her brilliant train of thought, but his massive hand rested gently on the back of her chair in a silent promise of eternal support. A mini cliffhanger hung in the structural air as Rhea suddenly paused, her thermal intuition picking up a strange low-frequency vibration traveling through the mountain stone from the far northern pass, a rhythmic, mechanical pulsing that did not match the movements of the Southern Empire, signaling that a completely unexpected new variable had just arrived at the outer perimeter of their secret domain. The low-frequency vibration traveling through the mountain stone sent an immediate chill through the bedrock of the sanctuary, though Rhea's face remained as unyielding as the basalt columns around her. She didn't drop her drafting charcoal. Instead, she pressed her scarred palm flat against the smooth surface of her wooden desk, closing her eyes to interpret the subterranean data. The pulsing was rhythmic, heavy, but lacked the chaotic, brutal resonance of the Southern Iron Empire's mechanized siege engines. This was something completely different, a steady, highly controlled mechanical tread that felt remarkably organized, originating from the old forgotten northern pass that led directly into the deep tundra territories. Garrick saw the subtle shift in her posture, his body instantly transitioning into a state of absolute quiet alertness. He didn't roar for his guard or reach for a weapon in blind panic. He simply stepped closer to her side, his gray eyes locked onto hers, waiting for the structural diagnosis. "It's not the South," Rhea whispered, her cool voice cutting through the dim silence of the laboratory. "The kinetic frequency is too light for their iron-plated battalions, but too heavy for common refugees. Someone is moving through the old tundra passes with high-grade transport machinery. They've already breached our outer perimeter sensors." Within minutes, the front gates of the cavern echoed with a sharp, synchronized signal from the frontier sentries, a series of rapid metallic clangs that indicated a peaceful but highly armed approach. Rhea stood up, buckling her silver crescent blade to her hip, with an absolute lack of hesitation, while Garrick moved to her left, his massive frame acting as an impregnable wall of physical defense. They walked out onto the main furnace floor together, where the remaining colony workers had already gathered in a tight defensive formation, their newly forged kinetic short swords gleaming dark and lethal under the radiant amber glow of the fires. The atmosphere was thick with slow burn anticipation, the entire community standing as a singular unified organism ready to defend their new home. The massive, reinforced iron doors of the outer gallery groaned open, allowing a blast of freezing winter wind and white snow to swirl into the chamber. As the mist slowly cleared, it revealed a sight that made the former Royal Guardsmen gasp in absolute. A small, immaculate convoy of advanced snowcrawler transports stood idling at the threshold, their heavy treads designed to glide effortlessly over deep tundra ice. Standing at the head of the convoy was a tall, striking alpha female clad in dense white wolf fur armor that bore the ancient, forgotten sigil of the Northern Vanguard's outermost border garrison, a legion that the High Capital Court had declared dead and abandoned over a decade ago during the First Terror. The female commander stepped forward into the warmth of the forge, her sharp, icy blue eyes scanning the massive structural reinforcements of the cavern before finally landing on the scarred hands of the Omega standing at the center of the room. She did not look at King Garrick first. Her gaze remained fixed on Rhea with an expression of profound professional reverence. "We tracked the seismic shockwave of the Black Gorge landslide from 50 miles away," the commander stated, her voice carrying the crisp, disciplined tone of a true frontier warrior. "Our scouts reported that the Southern Iron Empire's Grand Battalion had been entirely obliterated by a masterfully executed kinetic demolition. I'm General Freya of the Frostspire Garrison, and we have come searching for the brilliant engineer who just rewrote the laws of northern warfare." Garrick stepped forward by a fraction of an inch, the firelight illuminating his simple leather apron and the deep scars across his face. "Freya," he said, his deep voice resonant with a mixture of recognition and sudden profound realization. "The Capital Court cut off your supplies 10 years ago because they believed your innovative tactics were a threat to traditional alpha dominance. You survived in the deep tundra." General Freya finally looked at her former king, her features softening with a touch of grim satisfaction as she observed his humbled, hard-working appearance. "We did more than survive, Your Majesty," she replied, gesturing openly to the advanced transports behind her. "We innovated. While your high counselors were busy admiring their ornamental gold and looking down on the lower castes, we were building an underground network of high-tech resistance. But we lacked the advanced metallurgy required to pierce the Southern Empire's main fortresses. We have the machinery, we have the soldiers, but we needed a master smith who could forge the future. We came to offer our total allegiance to the sovereign of the iron." A wave of profound emotion rippled through the cavern as the refugees realized that they were no longer a lonely, isolated group of exiles hiding in the rocks. They were now the absolute spearhead of a grand, highly advanced liberation army. General Freya dropped to her knee, striking her armored fist against her chest plate in a solemn voluntary oath of loyalty, not to the royal crown of the old world, but to Rhea and the brilliant new covenant she had created in the ashes. One by one, the elite frontier troopers behind her followed her example, their modern weapons lowering in a beautiful cinematic display of absolute submission to her superior intellect. Rhea looked down at the gathering army, her sharp hazel eyes flashing with a sudden magnificent vision of the coming war. She saw the perfect synthesis of Freya's advanced transport machinery with her own layered volcanic steel, a combination so structurally flawless that no foreign iron empire could ever hope to withstand its kinetic impact. She looked at Garrick, seeing the absolute pride and loyal devotion shining in his gray eyes, and she knew that the final pieces of their destiny had just locked into place. The theme of the powerless becoming the ultimate savior of the realm had evolved from a desperate struggle for survival into a grand, unstoppable revolution. A mini cliffhanger hung heavily over the roaring furnace as Rhea raised her silver crescent blade high into the air, its flawless edge reflecting the dawn of a new era, while a distant secondary alarm began to wail from the communications array, revealing that the Southern Iron Emperor himself had just mobilized his main personal fleet to crush the mountain once and for all. The final synchronization between General Freya's advanced frontier machinery and Rhea's revolutionary kinetic metallurgy transformed the volcanic sanctuary into a terrifyingly efficient, modern industrial war complex. The dark basalt galleries no longer echoed with the simple, rhythmic clanking of manual hand mallets. Instead, they vibrated with the deep mechanical hum of high-tech manufacturing arrays. The crude snowcrawler transports brought by the Frostspire garrison were systematically disassembled and rebuilt within the lower bays, their external chassis reinforced with overlapping plates of the new layered volcanic steel that could easily absorb the high-velocity impacts of the Southern Empire's modern artillery. King Garrick stood at the center of the main assembly deck, his massive frame dripping with sweat as he helped a team of frontier mechanics bolt a massive hand-forged kinetic ram to the front of the primary command vehicle. He had completely shed every single remnant of his old sovereign identity, finding an absolute liberating peace in his role as the physical anchor of Rhea's grand design. Every movement he made was executed with a quiet, disciplined humility that completely captivated the refugees and soldiers working beside him. His gray eyes constantly sought out Rhea's figure on the high catwalks, his heart swelling with a slow-burn devotion that was no longer driven by the frantic biological pull of a fated bond, but by a profound, lifetime commitment to the woman who had saved his soul from the ashes of his own arrogance. Rhea stood above the production floor, her sharp hazel eyes tracking the absolute fluidity of the industrial machine she had set in motion. Her mind was entirely clear, cool, and analytical, completely insulated from the rising panic that gripped the outer settlements as the Southern Empire's main personal fleet drew closer to the mountain ridges. She held a thick, heavy carbon stylus, plotting the defensive coordinates of her new stationary kinetic ballista system directly onto a large sheet of volcanic slate. She knew that the Southern Emperor was arriving with absolute, unyielding intent, bringing 3 massive armored dreadnought vessels that floated on high-pressure thermal thrusters, supported by over 2,000 elite mechanized iron troops. It was an apocalyptic eradication force designed to wipe her entire culture from the face of the earth. But Rhea did not see a catastrophe. She saw a massive, over-engineered system with highly predictable structural vulnerabilities. The Emperor's flagship relies on a centralized pressurized steam core to maintain its aerial stabilization, Rhea explained to Garrick and General Freya as they gathered around her drafting table later that evening, the heavy scent of hot coal and wild lavender wrapping around them like a protective shield. She tapped the stylus against the detailed schematic of the Southern Dreadnought. The armor plates protecting the core are 3 inches thick, made of traditional tempered iron. A standard Alpha Vanguard would waste hours trying to pierce it with brute physical force. But our new layered cobalt bolts can slice clean through that molecular structure if fired at a velocity of 300 meters per second. We don't need to fight their entire 2,000-man army. We only need to shatter the core of the primary vessel, and the resulting kinetic feedback will bring the entire fleet crashing into the ravines. General Freya let out a low, appreciative whistle, her icy blue eyes flashing with absolute professional awe at the sheer magnificent precision of the plan. "It's an engineering execution," the general murmured, striking her fist against the table in total agreement. "My snowcrawlers can draw their vanguard into the narrowest bottleneck of the high passes, keeping their artillery distracted, while you and the king position the primary kinetic ballista on the western precipice. We will give you exactly 1 clear window of opportunity to make the shot." The final hours before the battle bled away in a silent, hyper-focused countdown that unified the entire colony into a single breathing instrument of war. The old social hierarchies of the capital had been completely obliterated and replaced by a beautifully structured meritocracy where every citizen, alpha, beta, or omega, understood their exact value to the survival of the collective whole. When the first deep, terrifying horn of the Southern Fleet finally echoed through the outer blizzards, signaling that the massive dreadnoughts had breached the cloud cover, there was no screaming, no panic running, and no desperate prayers to indifferent gods. The Northern Resistance simply picked up their dark, iridescent kinetic weapons and marched out into the freezing storm, their faces hardened by the fierce, independent spirit of the mountain itself. The cinematic scale of the confrontation materialized in the white darkness of the high passes as the Southern Emperor's flagship broke through the mist, a massive black iron monster that cast a terrifying shadow over the pristine snow. Its heavy mechanical turrets stood cocked and ready, their glowing blue lenses scanning the ridges for any signs of movement. But before the Empire's artillery could open fire on the hidden paths, General Freya's reinforced snowcrawler convoy erupted from the lower ravines like a pack of white wolves, their high-speed treads kicking up massive clouds of ice as they began their highly coordinated, disruptive maneuvering. The southern dreadnoughts immediately pivoted their massive weapons downward to counter the unexpected threat, their heavy steel shells obliterating the empty crags in a series of earth-shattering explosions that shook the entire mountain. On the high western precipice, completely hidden by the roaring gale, Rhea and Garrick worked in absolute wordless synchronization to deploy the primary kinetic ballista. The massive weapon was a true masterpiece of advanced mechanics, its long launching rail forged from a single piece of iridescent volcanic iron and its tension cables woven from flexible, high-tensile cobalt wire. Garrick wrapped his massive arms around the heavy iron winch, his muscles knotting and groaning with an agonizing intensity as he manually pulled the cable back until it locked into the primary firing pin. His teeth bared against the freezing wind as he gave every single ounce of his physical strength to her design. Rhea knelt at the aiming sights, her scarred fingers adjusting the alignment levers by fractions of a millimeter as she calculated the wind resistance and the thermal drift of the approaching flagship. The slow burn romance between them achieved its absolute breathtaking climax in that single, frozen moment under the winter sky. Garrick looked down at her, his gray eyes shining with a deep, infinite trust that required absolutely no words to validate. He was completely willing to stand beside her until the end of time, serving as the steady, immovable anchor for her brilliant genius. Rhea met his gaze for a fraction of a second, a small, confident smile softening her sharp hazel features before she turned her focus back to the target. The southern flagship swung its main battery toward their ridge, its automated sensors finally detecting the energy signature of the... A mini cliffhanger hung heavily in the freezing air as the Emperor's cannons began to glow with a murderous blue energy, while Rhea's finger slowly tightened around the primary release lever of her weapon, the fate of their entire civilization hanging by a single fraying thread of molten steel. Rhea did not allow the terrifying glow of the enemy's main battery to break her absolute scientific concentration. She held her breath, matching the steady, rhythmic pulse of her heart to the internal vibrations of the volcanic bedrock beneath her heavy leather boots. Her scarred fingers made one final, microscopic adjustment to the horizontal alignment lever, locking the aiming sights directly onto the single, unreinforced structural seam where the southern flagship's primary steam core met the external iron hull plating. "Now, Garrick," she commanded, her cool, analytical voice slicing through the roar of the blizzard like a sharpened razor edge. Garrick didn't hesitate for a single microsecond. His massive right hand slammed down upon the primary release lever with an explosive physical violence that instantly unleashed the compressed kinetic energy stored within the high-tensile cobalt cables. The primary ballista did not let out a standard, smoky roar. Instead, it produced a high, beautiful harmonic hum that vibrated through the absolute marrow of their bones as the 3-inch thick layered volcanic bolt was propelled forward down the iridescent launching rail. The weapon recoiled with an immense, ground-shaking force that would have shattered a traditional alpha carriage, but Rhea's advanced geometric stabilizers absorbed the kinetic feedback flawlessly, redirecting the energy straight into the solid mountain stone. The dark, iridescent projectile sliced through the howling gale with an absolute, mathematically perfect trajectory, completely defying the violent crosswinds of the mountain pass. It traveled at a staggering velocity of 300 meters per second, its sleek, layered cobalt structure cutting clean through the freezing air like a literal needle of dark light. Before the automated sensors of the southern flagship could even calculate an evasion vector, the bolt struck the exact millimeter of the target Rhea had selected. The 3-inch thick traditional tempered iron hull plating did not bend or deflect the missile. It shattered instantly upon contact under the supreme innovative density of the volcanic alloy. The bolt punched clean through the external defensive barrier, driving deep into the pressurized heart of the centralized steam core with an absolute, unyielding momentum. For a fraction of a second, the massive black iron dreadnought remained entirely suspended in the air, a silent, monstrous ghost pinned against the gray winter sky. Then, the kinetic feedback loop manifested with a catastrophic, apocalyptic violence. The sudden catastrophic depressurization of the core caused the high-pressure thermal thrusters to backfire simultaneously, sending a massive wave of liquid fire and white steam ripping through the internal framework of the entire. The structural beams sheared away along their molecular fault lines, and the massive flagship began to tear itself apart from the inside out, its heavy mechanical turrets spinning out of control as their glowing blue lenses flickered and died. The enormous iron monster lost its aerial stabilization completely, plunging downward into the high ravines with a terrifying crushing weight that generated a massive earth-shattering shockwave upon impact. The secondary and tertiary dreadnoughts, moving in their rigid, highly predictable southern formation, were completely unable to react to the sudden, catastrophic destruction of their lead command vessel. The burning remnants of the flagship crashed directly into their lower thruster arrays, dragging all three massive armored ships down into a single, chaotic, tangled vortex of twisted iron and exploding fuel cells. The grand 2,000-man personal fleet of the Southern Iron Emperor was systematically obliterated in less than 2 minutes, transformed into a massive smoking field of worthless scrap metal that filled the lower passes of the Black Gorge from one side to the other. The roaring fire of the explosion slowly subsided into the deep, echoing silence of the mountain peaks, leaving behind a thick cloud of dark iridescent smoke that drifted lazily over the valley. On the high western precipice, the remaining frontier troopers and the factory workers let out a sudden deafening roar of absolute unmitigated victory, a collective cry of freedom that carried across the entire mountain range and signaled the permanent end of their oppression. They had not just survived an invasion, they had completely dismantled the greatest military empire in the modern world, using nothing but the raw, unyielding power of intellect, innovation, and strategic resilience. Garrick slowly released his grip on the ballista winch, his massive frame shaking with a mixture of physical exhaustion and profound, overwhelming emotion. He looked down at the smoking ruins of the Southern Fleet, then turned his gaze slowly toward Rhea, who stood beside the launching rail with her silver crescent blade resting quietly against her hip. The fine layer of soot and ash coating her sharp features could not hide the magnificent, absolute glow of her genius. The old world was officially dead, its rigid hierarchies and shallow vanities buried forever under the snow, and the future of their entire civilization now belonged entirely to the independent Omega who had conquered the fire. Garrick took a slow step forward, his gray eyes shining with an intense, raw vulnerability as he reached out to gently clasp her scarred right hand in his own large, calloused palm. He did not speak a single word of his past royal guilt, nor did he make a hollow promise of protection. Instead, he knelt before her in the pristine white snow, his head bowing in deep, eternal reverence to his true mate, his sovereign and his equal. He was entirely ready to spend the rest of his days serving as the loyal shield for her brilliant mind, walking beside her as a partner in the new, innovative empire they were about to build together from the ground up. Rhea looked down at his bowing form, a slow, beautiful, and confident smile finally breaking through her cool, analytical expression. She didn't tell him to stand up as an inferior, nor did she push him away. Instead, her fingers tightened around his hand with a firm, unyielding grip that sealed their permanent, unbreakable covenant. She looked out over the high ridges where the northern refugees and the frontier soldiers were already moving forward to build their new capital around her volcanic forge, their faces illuminated by the bright golden light of the morning sun breaking through the mountain mist. The long, agonizing winter of their exile was finally over, and a magnificent new era of iron, intellect, and absolute freedom had just begun. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.